Grateful you're here to the 18th Annual McCain Conference. My name is Blues Baker. I serve at the Naval Academy Stockdale Center as the Director of Influencer Development. We have a nucleus of the Naval Academy called the midshipmen, and around that nucleus is a shell, and the shell consists of the faculty and the coaches and the staff that support those midshipmen in their ethical leadership growth. And so I'm investing in the faculty, staff, and coaches. And it's a privilege for me to be introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Jack Goldstone, who's professor of public policy at George Mason University, senior fellow of Mercatus Center, global policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center, previous faculty member at Northwestern University and University of California, a visiting scholar at Cambridge University, Stanford University, and UCLA, among others. Dr. Goldstone's a recipient of many awards, including the American Sociological Association's Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Award. He's held fellowships with the MacArthur Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, the U.S. Institute for Peace, and the Mellon Foundation, and he led the National Academy of Sciences study on the USAID's democracy assistance policies. His most recent books include Revolutions, a very short introduction, and Revolution and Rebellion. The Revolution, a very short introduction, published in 2014, and The Revolution and Rebellion, published in 2016. So let's give him a welcome from the Naval Academy as he delivers our keynote address, Just Wars, the Consequences of Revolutions. Thank you, sir.
Welcome. Thank you. Well, thanks to everyone for plunging into the thorny ethical issues regarding revolutions and their consequences. Revolutions created the United States of America, created the French Republic, which raised the rights of citizens above the privileges of aristocrats, and freed Eastern Europe from communism. Those are good things. Revolutions also created the Soviet Union, produced Mao's fanatical communist regime in China, and initiated the Mexican Civil War. Those events killed over 60 million people. As Admiral Carter said this morning, more recent revolutions in Syria, Afghanistan have displaced almost 10 million people over the last 15 years. Revolutions are responsible for some of the greatest and some of the worst consequences in human history. So how then can we say anything consistent or worthwhile about the consequences of revolutions? Now, this is not an abstract problem. It's a policy problem that recurs for great powers, and particularly has for the United States. There are three circumstances in which we get drawn into issues of revolution. One is when circumstances thrust the choice upon us, when a revolution breaks out, as in Kosovo, as Tunisia, Afghanistan, and the United States is faced with appeals from either the government or the rebels or world opinion to take a stand and perhaps to intervene on one side or the other. The second situation is when the United States identifies rogue regimes or bad actors and looks for ways to either help or participate in the overthrow of such bad actor regimes, as we did with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and has perhaps sometimes been raised as a desirable outcome with regard to the clerical regime in Iran. A third is a more principled position. The United States, after all, is the world's oldest, richest democracy, founded in a revolution against tyranny. So doesn't the United States have a standing responsibility, some have even argued an obligation as an exceptional nation, to support rebellions against tyranny wherever they occur? In the words of John F. Kennedy, he pledged to undertake any burden in the support of liberty around the world. Now, in fact, broad principles don't get us very far in making the practical decisions on which side we should take or whether we should get engaged at all in ongoing revolutions. This is because it's all too easy to find choices that have led us into trouble in either direction. If one tried to take a blanket approach and say, we should just support rebellions against dictators wherever they occur, that's neither been our policy, nor would it have always been prudent. Throughout the Cold War, the United States was concerned to prevent uprisings, particularly those that seemed to be motivated by a desire to create communist regimes, even when such rebellions targeted odious dictatorships. So the United States put order above rebellion, even when rebels claimed that they were seeking a freedom and popular outcome. Other cases, rebels have had ideologies that we found dangerous, not just communism, but for example, the Islamic State wanted to replace the regimes in the Middle East, even, as I say, some odious dictatorships, with an Islamist state that we found to be an even greater threat to our values and interests. There are other cases, the Huks in the Philippines, the Mau Maus in Kenya, where we found the interests of ourselves or allies in an order that we had created was threatened by rebels. So clearly, a broad support for rebels has not been or is not likely to be a U.S. policy. On the other hand, we certainly would not want to take the opposite view and always prioritize the existing order above the efforts of rebels. The overthrow of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe generally were seen to be good things for their citizens and for the United States and for Europe, the unity of Europe. The rebellion, even in places like Kosovo, turned out to be something that could be managed and in the end supported to give self-determination and all of the respect we accord to that concept a concrete expression. So in some cases, clearly supporting revolutionary efforts has been U.S. policy and has led to good outcomes. How then can we develop some criteria or understanding of what should guide our policies? Here we need to look to the experience and the historical case data that has been compiled by scholars of revolution to get some guidance. I'd say the main principle that has emerged in the last dozen years of research is that it is peaceful revolutions that are most likely to produce free and peaceful government. Now that notion, peaceful revolution, may sound like a contradiction in terms, but we have seen a growing number of revolutions that were carried out by means of peaceful mass demonstrations rather than by armed confrontation or violent riots that have sometimes been labeled color revolutions, velvet revolutions, but they were increasingly seen from the Yellow Revolution in the Philippines that overthrew the Marcos dictatorship to the opposition to communist rule in the Baltic states, in Eastern Europe, and eventually even in the Soviet Union. Subsequently, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine, more recently the Euromaidan Revolution of 2014 in Ukraine. All of these were movements where violence was by and large minimal or incidental rather than the primary route by which revolutionaries came to power. And the outcome of such peaceful revolutions has been generally more peaceful in the outcome and more stable and democratic in the outcome than revolutions that were accomplished by violence. Now, you'll have a talk tomorrow afternoon. I hope everyone will stay till the end of tomorrow. Professor Maria Stephan will go into more detail on how it is possible that peaceful revolutions can succeed. Why, in fact, do we find that peaceful mass protests in the last dozen years, even since the beginning of the century, have been more successful than violent attempts at overthrowing regimes? I'll simply focus on one element, and that is there are things the United States and its allies can do before a revolution begins that help ensure the desired outcome of peaceful and peacefully accomplished revolutions. That is, to the extent that the United States, its allies, create an impetus in the international system with support for free expression, civil liberties, human rights, the truthful information, and constraints on government, to the extent that we promote that as normative, desirable, as pointed out in the UN Declaration of Universal Rights, as long as there are powerful actors in the world shaping global climate to create a belief that freedom is fundamental and primary and will be supported, and that tyranny is culpable, wrongful, and on the way out, that international climate acts as a constraint on dictators and as a support for peaceful advocates of revolutionary change. And indeed, throughout the entire Cold War, the support that was given through everything from the Helsinki Accords to support for peaceful activists and dissidents in Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, helped them forge the networks that allowed their movements to survive and undermined the confidence of communist elites and other authoritarian leaders around the world. It's not often recognized that when the Cold War ended, authoritarian regimes were not only overturned in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. There was a wave, what Samuel Huntington's called the third wave of revolutions, that spread across Asia and Africa as the normative belief that democracy and republican government was the modern form of government that would eventually be adopted. It put dictators on the defensive. It encouraged elites to seek the benefits of membership in the international system by creating constitutional governments, and encouraged intellectuals, activists, journalists, and professionals seeking democratic outcomes to present themselves as the way by which their countries could move forward and join the ranks of modern nations. To the extent that we do not do that, to the extent that we normalize dictatorship as just another option, a reasonable form of government by way of which countries can maintain order, democracy is fine for the United States, but we're not going to promote it elsewhere in the world, we reinforce the ability of dictators to mold their societies and to repress opposition movements. We make it more likely that peaceful resistance will be suppressed, and that those who oppose tyrannical and authoritarian regimes will be forced into violent or underground choices. We therefore make it both less likely that peaceful revolutions will emerge and succeed, and more likely that violent revolutions will eventually occur. Now, what does that mean if revolutions have to turn to violence? Why is that a bad choice? We can look at our own history and say, the American Revolution was accomplished by a lengthy war. We mobilized the population, we fought against the armies of Great Britain, and we created a free constitutional state. Why can't other countries recapitulate our success? Why can't we encourage that? Well, here we have to look very carefully at the conditions behind the success of the American Revolution, and it was really quite unique. The American Revolution occurred in a country in which the Anglo-Saxon tradition of self-governance, elections, and parliamentary representation were already well established. It is true that there were royal governors in the American colonies, but the American colonies had also elected representatives to local state legislatures who worked with the royal governors. The Americans saw themselves not so much as fighting a foreign power or an alien tradition, rather they felt they were fighting for their own traditions as free Englishmen to claim the rights that they were due under previous British acts like the Act of Toleration, the Act of 1688, that guaranteed many of the rights that we would then incorporate in our own Constitution and Bill of Rights. That is, Americans looked to the British tradition and saw the right to jury trial, the right to be free of unreasonable search and seizure, the right to limits on royal authority as part of their own tradition, and they had experience and practice in doing so. So when they threw off the dominion of the King of Great Britain, they had their own framework of electoral institutions in which they had a fair degree of faith, experience, and practice. That's actually quite rare. If you look at countries where people have sought to overthrow dictators, particularly in the contemporary world, the movement for freedom and democracy may be led by intellectuals, professionals, and journalists and activists, but they do not have their own tradition or broad popular experience of working with democratic institutions. Instead, as one of my friends, Steve Hademan, said at a talk he gave last week, it's often the case that tyrannical regimes around the world consist of a big thug ruling through a lot of lesser thugs. And if you simply knock off the top thug, you don't create a situation where you have free space to create new institutions. You simply create an opportunity for all the lesser thugs to expand their domain or fight with each other for power. And so the result of a sudden collapse of authority or change in government in many authoritarian regimes is going to be, as we have seen in Syria, Libya, Iraq, more likely to be the outbreak of violence and civil war than the spontaneous generation of a constitutional democratic peace. Think for a moment about the institutions that are left behind. Let us say that well-meaning, democratic, liberal revolutionaries seek to overthrow a corrupt, tyrannical regime. We wish to support them, encourage their efforts, find that they've succeeded. At that point, what happens next? What we found from experience at the end of World War II in Germany and Japan, it requires enormous follow-up, maybe even to the level of military occupation, to give sufficient leverage to the new democratic movement to overcome all of the evil, undemocratic institutions that had prevailed in the old regime. For example, if the police have been accustomed to seeing their role as the protection of the political and economic elite while keeping the people in order, how do you persuade the police force that their actual role should be to protect the rights of ordinary citizens? It takes years of retraining in democratic policing to instill an ethos of protecting the people as the primary role of law enforcement. In the courts, the majority of judges are likely to have been accustomed to corruption. I recall one story from a friend who said he was in a lawyer's office in a corrupt country and talking to the lawyer about an upcoming case. He asked the lawyer why he had so few law books in his office and why he wasn't busy preparing for his case. And the lawyer said, I'm not worried, we're going to win. And my friend said, how are you going to be so sure? And he said, it's no problem. We can afford a larger bribe to the judge than our opponents, so we will win. And that was normal practice. So one has to install a judiciary that will respect rule of law and enforce it. Now, those are not processes that are easily done overnight. If all of the school texts are full of praise for the deposed dictator and criticism of freedom and Western rights, how do you continue to operate your schools when they're filled with works of propaganda? It is not a simple or immediate job to rebuild a society in a way that people can become accustomed to being comfortable thinking, I have rights, I can trust the police and the judiciary to protect my rights, and oh, by the way, I also have a chance to play a role in choosing who will be our leaders. It's particularly difficult in a situation in which so many countries in the world are now illiberal democracies, in which people think of elections simply as a means by which one harsh, oppressive leader is chosen in preference to another. The idea that the core of democracy starts with popular sovereignty, protection of civil liberties, and individual rights is quite alien, even in many countries that do hold elections and claim democracy in the title of their nation. Other factors that matter. The peaceful color revolutions, the revolution in the United States in 1776, were successful in large measure because they had limited goals. The goals of the revolution against tyranny was limited to replacing an authoritarian or unaccountable government with a regime that would be accountable and would respect the rights of citizens. The revolutions in the United States, in the color revolutions in the Philippines and Ukraine and so on, they were not exclusionary, ideological, or vanguard revolutions. That is, they did not have a world view that they used the revolution to spread. When there is such an ideology, even revolutions that start out with good intention and with a broad coalition tend to degenerate. The Iranian Revolution against the Shah brought together a huge number of elements of Iranian society, oil field workers, Western intellectuals, as well as clerics, as well as those who were simple patriots for Iran and saw the Shah as too beholden to the United States. But this broad coalition eventually was reshaped by clerics who felt they had a mission in creating an Islamic republic to act as a vanguard for Islamic revolution against secular and pro-Western regimes. They were not successful in externally spreading this idea, but internally, the clerical regime turned against secular supporters and narrowed the basis for membership and participation and created, through quite a considerable amount of post-revolutionary violence, what we now see as the Iranian Islamic Republic. Now, that republic, I have to say, has some truly democratic features. It has elections for president that have repeatedly produced surprises in who was the victor. And any election process in which the winner comes as a total shock or surprise cannot be seen as a undemocratic, rigged process, even if the candidates themselves are carefully vetted and selected in advance. But for the most part, the Iranian Revolution has been a fairly restrictive, oppressive, and limited regime for its own people, much to the surprise of many of those who promoted it. But the presence of a strong exclusionary vanguard ideology tends to drive out all alternatives and eliminate pluralism. So whether in Cuba, Nicaragua, places that started out with high hopes for overcoming terrible, odious dictatorships and creating broad popular movements, the triumph of an ideology of, in these cases, communism, in other cases, Islamism, that was hostile to any alternatives led to undesirable outcomes. So violence is dangerous as a mode of revolutionary practice. Violent revolutions tend to produce violent, oppressive regimes. And ideologically exclusionist and vanguard revolutions also tend to deteriorate and become more oppressive in order to meet their exclusionary goals. Now, something else that we can say that's both hopeful and discouraging. Recent research has demonstrated that the age structure of a society is strongly associated with political processes and political outcomes. Societies that are younger, a lower median age, a larger proportion of young adults aged 12 to 30, have a higher level of political violence and political conflict than societies that are older in age structure. And when revolutions occur in such countries, they are more likely to be drawn in the direction of ideological extremes. Young people tend to be more idealistic, more utopian, more passionate, and therefore more vulnerable to the appeal of ideologies that promise great transformation. In more mature societies, that is, those with, say, a median age around 28, 30, or even higher, we find political conflict is usually less violent and is more likely to lead to stable outcomes. So it's no coincidence that most of the successful color revolutions have occurred in countries with a higher median age. On the other hand, where revolutions have occurred and even leading to what we thought were hopeful situations, youthful populations were drawn into conflict and tended to exacerbate already existing cleavages. So a country like South Sudan, brought into existence by a revolutionary movement seeking freedom from the Arab oppression based in Khartoum, seeking to create indigenous governments, even with international support, even with hopes for a constitutional regime, all too quickly deteriorated into tribal warfare. That could have been at least seen as likely given the extremely young age profile of that region. Same thing is true in Syria, Iraq, very youthful countries. On the other hand, the good news in this is if it should be the case that protest should lead to major regime challenges in countries like Cuba, Russia, China, Belarus, it's very likely that those protests will remain peaceful, and if they result in a regime change, that the resulting revolutionary transformation is more likely to be negotiated, stable, and democratic. I'm not saying it will happen anytime soon. We're talking about countries that are quite paranoid about any popular resistance and take stern measures to avoid it. But at the same time, countries that are authoritarian and suffer economic crises do often go through periods of protest where they become vulnerable. So the good news is that the mature age structures of many of the large authoritarian countries of the world today suggest we have a good chance, if we support peaceful revolutionary means, of seeing desirable outcomes. The unpleasant news is that in many parts of the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, we still see very youthful populations where civil conflict and revolution is more likely to lead to violent outcomes, civil war, and continued unrest. So the ethical answer, in a sense, of how a great power can approach revolution in the world is to say, we recognize that in mature societies, revolutions carried out by peaceful means are likely to produce desirable outcomes. And it would be reasonable, ethical, and practical for the United States to support an international climate promoting human rights, condemning tyranny, and even giving support where possible to movements of peaceful protest that aim for democratic transitions in authoritarian countries. However, in younger societies or in revolutionary movements that have strong ideological commitments, those situations are so likely to produce bad outcomes that it would be wise to remain at least detached if possible and not to make the mistake of optimistically promoting or supporting revolution without great attention to the risks of adverse outcomes that would arise. So the words I would leave you with are, beware the romance of revolutions. The idea that by eliminating a tyrannical or odious regime, one clears the space for a flowering of democracy and freedom is simply historically untrue. Only in rare cases where revolutions have been carried out either peacefully or in countries that already had practice, experience, and knowledge of democratic institutions has that scenario unfolded. Far more commonly, revolutions have realized the worst fears of those who argue that revolution, as previous speakers, Victoria and Michael said, that revolution and rebellion breed such disastrous disorder, civil war, and violence that even tolerating tyranny a few years more, a decade more, may be preferable to the burdens that are unleashed. Sadly, if one visits and talks to people in Libya or Syria today, one gets that immediate feedback of nostalgia for the days when a dictator, however hateful and dangerous, at least provided order in daily life, allowed people to find a place to live, and allowed people to raise their children with a lesser degree of fear and anxiety than they feel today. So there are courses to take, but the problem of revolution is going to be with us. As I said, whether revolution is thrust upon us by people undertaking rebellions in particular cases, whether there are regimes that for one reason or another we find so distasteful and dangerous that we are motivated to undertake or explore how they might be changed, or whether it's the case that people around the world appeal to the United States on the basis of its history, on the basis of its ideology for support of revolution. All of these will remain with us. We need to be careful, we need to be wary, we need to be deeply conscious of our ethical obligations and the risks that are involved, but at the same time, we need also to be aware of, and in some cases, to welcome the possibilities of change. Thank you. I'll take questions, sir. Blue, do you want to come up and take the questions for me? Give me a hand. We have microphones that will come to you, I believe, right? There was one question over here I saw.
Excellent.
Hi, I'm Steve Woodside, West Point. So I wonder if, so even if we concede that the points about how supporting revolutions in younger states and the consequences that can come with that, I wonder if that's a good enough argument to say that we ought not to support those, because we might be romancing revolutions in a different sense when we give arguments like that and saying that the success of a revolution is that we get it right the first time, or the people there get it right the first time. But maybe if we take a sort of a, longer view on things, that it might be a good thing to support revolutions that topple the authoritarian regime, but they don't have the right infrastructure, they don't have the right this and that. But that takes time.
Yeah.
And they may not get the right leaders that come right after, but that's okay, because it's a process, and this is something that takes time, something like that.
Yeah, there is an argument to be made for patience, but I find that argument only to be appealing if the patience is backed up by a commitment to deliver resources over the time required for the construction of state capacity to emerge. This is something that Professor Krasner alluded to early on. It's a process that we still don't fully understand, certainly that we have to confess we've not shown an ability to control. And so if you say, isn't it worth it in the long run to dislodge a terrible regime and give people a chance to find their way forward gradually, however that unfolds, to a better future? If people undertake that, I think it's fair to be said people have the right to choose their futures and take their risks. But if you say, should we encourage that and support it, I would say only under the circumstances where we're prepared to make a commitment to at least help establish good enough governance to avoid the real downside risks, massacres, genocides, mass refugee problems that might emerge in the time. Now, I sometimes tell people who get pessimistic about the world today, think of Europe, 1932, 33. The Great Depression has occurred, authoritarian regimes are emerging, and I'm able, with my knowledge of the future, to reassure people and say, okay, things look really bad now in the 1930s. They may get a little worse, but by the 1960s, right? But by the 1960s, Europe will be freer and more prosperous than you can imagine. Would that be fair to encourage them, knowing that World War II lay in between? And my answer is no. You want to make people aware that there must be a better way to get from the 1930s to the 1960s than to go through World War II, and all that went with it. So that argument about, yes, eventually it will get better and we need to be patient, always has to be weighed against the cost in blood and suffering. And sometimes that process of, dislodge a revolutionary state, wait for capacity to emerge, if that capacity turns out to be a more repressive, more ideologically driven outcome, you may be asking people to wait a lifetime, as was the case with Maoist China, before things get better. Again, things are better for Chinese people now than they've ever been. And they're certainly far better than they were during the Japanese invasion of the 30s and the time when the communists were seeking to, as they say, help China stand up. But the outcome of Mao's success was the starvation of roughly 30 million people during the Great Leap Forward and the Proletarian Revolution. So again, my reading of history is that violent revolution is a very risky, high-cost mode of getting where you want to be. And you're much better off through a peaceful uprising or negotiated transition than you are by saying, well, we have to do something, so let's break some crockery, break some eggs, and hope we get the omelet we want, instead of just a runny mess. Dislike that. That's a very good question. Thank you.
Question here.
Thank you for your very nuanced analysis. I wonder if you would add into that mix of under what situations are the change likely to work or not. Economic factors, like looking at the World Bank's conflict trap analysis, that countries that are natural resource dependent or that don't have a diversified economy are going to more likely continue in patterns of violence and not lead to a peaceful outcome. Or the look at the insurgencies where it works or where it doesn't, says the more fractionalized, more divided the opposition to the regime is, the longer and more bloody the outcomes are. Are there any other, that you would point out besides the youth bulge, that a lot of research shows that youth bulge? Because if you do that, you really end up at a policy more like the engagement and enlargement doctrine, which everybody hated, because it's, oh, well, we pick winners and losers. But that's a very pragmatic,
again,
kind of approach. Just what your thoughts are.
Very good question. There are numerous factors, and I will say, on the optimistic side, good leadership can overcome a great variety of problems. On the resource curse, for example, Botswana, Professor Krasner mentioned, is a country that was able to take advantage of its wealth in diamonds and move its country forward. It did so because it did not have deep fissures of ethnic groups that had been in historic conflict, so it was able to overcome some of the distrust measures that weaken democracy in more multi-ethnic countries. And it had leadership that was willing to focus on enriching the country rather than just enriching itself. So the difference in leadership, I think, makes a huge difference. Now, even the issue of tribal cleavages is not something that automatically condemns countries to failure. In Kenya, when the leaders of different tribal groups decided it was worthwhile to come together, they were able to pull off reasonably peaceful and successful elections. It was when the leaders of different ethnic groups felt that they were being cheated or excluded that we had violence as a result of staging elections. So the choices made by leaders makes a huge difference. Someone like Nelson Mandela was able to negotiate a peaceful transition in South Africa in circumstances that could have led to a bloodbath if the more radical African first movement had taken the leadership of the opposition to apartheid. And I think South Africa is a very good case where you had extremists, both in the white government and in the Black Power movement, but you also had moderates on both sides, and the moderates decided to come together and negotiate a deal. Again, what Professor Krasner described as elites coming together to change their future And they did so successfully. Now, since then, of course, the temptation of natural resources has led to corruption in the ANC government, and so things have cycled a bit downward. But the contrast with, say, Zimbabwe, where there was also seemingly a black liberator in Robert Mugabe, who in his later years deteriorated into a more kleptocratic type ruler, and then the question comes, well, should the rest of Africa support regime change? Or would that be too dangerous and disruptive? And I think it probably would have been too dangerous given the polarization and ethnic conflicts that were always there beneath the surface in Zimbabwe. I don't think the new regime in Zimbabwe is a particularly nice one, but I do think it would be better for that to be changed by peaceful movements among its people and a transition than by a violent revolution at this point, because I don't see the good potential for an outcome of a violent event. Again, a lot of people, people are optimistic. People were hopeful that South Sudan would somehow emerge as a successful independent country. And again, I just thought the odds against that were so great that it was actually an unethical choice to promote that. Now you might say, well, we didn't have a choice because the people of the region were already in rebellion. Fair enough. And then you do everything you can to, again, invest in encouraging institutions that might work. But to simply encourage it and think you sign an independent statement and then a little bit of humanitarian aid will suffice, that's just simply not the way the world works. Other questions?
Yes.
Thanks, sir. Doyle Hodges. I'm a visiting fellow in the Stockdale Center.
Yeah.
You have a relatively charitable view of nonviolent revolutions, and I'm wondering where the threshold between a nonviolent political movement and a revolution is. Because I think of Chavez in Venezuela, I think of Erdogan in Turkey, President Xi in China, folks who through nonviolent populist-backed mechanisms have fundamentally altered the democratic norms or whatever norms of their governance were. Are you including those in your sorts of assessments of nonviolent revolutionary movements? And if not, where's that threshold?
Yeah. The threshold is always fuzzy, certainly, let me grant that. I consider, for example, there to have been some very dangerous revolutionary movements that came to power. Right? ISIS is a violent example, right? But the National Socialists in Germany used intimidation, a moderate degree of power. They staged street fights with their socialist opposition. They intimidated enemies. They persecuted minorities. But they, by and large, came to power in a peaceful and negotiated fashion. But I saw them as an ideological extreme group, and therefore, as I said, even peaceful revolutions can veer into very bad ways if they are motivated by an exclusionary vanguard-type ideology, as National Socialism was. I'll point out that the Iranian revolution against the Shah was a peaceful revolution in its execution. We lose sight of that, but it was the ever larger funeral processions that filled more streets and more cities that intimidated the Shah and persuaded him that he was losing control until he fled the country and turned things over to his prime minister, who eventually ceded to a deal with Khomeini for a change in power. So some movements use some violence. In the case of the ANC in South Africa, Mandela was earlier on affiliated with the violent sword and spear wing, and many people have argued that the violence was a necessary part of that. But I'm not sure I buy that, because I think it was the organization of the unions, COSATU, and the strikes in the mines that were more important, and the uprisings in the cities. Some of those uprisings were violent. There were, the tire burnings and so on. But the majority of popular mobilization against the apartheid regime kept to large mass demonstrations. The military wing and the violent demonstrations were secondary. But it goes both ways. In the Ukraine, in the Maidan, there was certainly some gunfire in the late stages that helped precipitate the decision of the government to fall. So I don't think one can be a purist and say, don't overturn a car, don't have anyone shoot in the air, avoid all violence. Now, Maria will talk to you in more detail about that tomorrow. But my view is it's quite common, even for peaceful, nonviolent revolutions, to have some violent conflict around the edges or popping up in the center, because these are confrontations, they are struggles over power. So the amazing thing is if they can remain predominantly peaceful, that's quite something, and that often takes quite a lot of planning, restraint, and organization. But it is always a bit fuzzy, and I think one has to simply say, where's the preponderant effort? Is the preponderant effort a violent confrontation with the forces of the government, or is the preponderant effort civil disobedience, mass demonstrations, occupying squares, and so on?
Is there a point in revolution where you find that with the rise of a tyranny, I'm thinking of Timothy Snyder's work on tyranny, and so that with the rise of tyranny and the dismantlement of government, as happened in the 1930s in Germany, the systematic dismantling of government, is there a time where you can make an ethical argument for violence when there's a failure of progressive, peaceful means?
Yeah. There's both a practical and an ethical argument to be made. The practical argument is that if you have a repressive regime that is stifling liberty, consolidating power, any means are justified to overthrow it. It's the it's the lesser versus the worse evil. I don't buy into that ethical argument because, in my view, that's a little bit like saying, if my house is on fire, I might need to build a backfire around the house to prevent that fire from spreading. But in fact, if I have no control over what I'm doing, and instead of managing a backfire, I just say, well, it's always necessary to fight fire with fire, and it doesn't matter if the fire that I set gets out of control and burns down 100 other houses. This is what I felt I had to do to save my house. I'd say, no, that's not true. It's your responsibility, if you're starting a fire, that you know you can control it, that you're prepared to deal with the consequences, and that you take responsibility for the outcome of what you start. So I view that the same way. If you're going to oppose a terrible regime and say, well, I think I have to use violence to deal with this horrible, genocidal, repressive regime, I would say, okay, but you're not justified in making that choice unless you believe you can control where that violence will go and what will be the outcome for other bystanders of the conflict that you're starting. And in most cases, I think it's too risky. The practical argument then is, what's the best way to dislodge this horrible regime? And the research that Stefan and Chenoweth and others have done suggests that even for terrible regimes, if it is the case that there's reasonably strong international support and that there are some divisions within the kind of shell of the ruling elite that could be cracked, then a combination of some violence but largely peaceful protest is going to be more successful. And the more you can make your protest peaceful, and the more you can recruit people to participate in demonstrations of opposition, the more likely you are in the end to obtain the outcome you wish. Now then you say, well, what about regimes like Communist China now, where it's a crime to start an NGO, where even churches are being demolished, where the leadership demands absolute loyalty to the party? There the choice sometimes is almost of risking martyrdom. So you have civil rights lawyers who know they're going to be jailed, but are willing to take a stand to defend civil rights and hope to inspire people at some point in the future to fight for the rights that they believe everyone should have. So in that case, the ethical choice may be to do something that won't have an immediate payoff, but it may be better to go to jail than to throw a bomb, to be more like Martin Luther King or Gandhi than to be like an anarchist. And again, when you talk about these ethical choices, I think you can't weigh them only against what is the evil of the regime that you're fighting. You have to weigh that against, and I think this is the point that was made in the previous panel, you have to weigh that against all the foreseeable consequences of your actions, no matter how your intent. Wait, I think a microphone's got to come to you. I probably shouldn't have chosen you when Blue was there. Blue, do you want to give that question first and then come over to Steve?
Sure, that'd be fine.
I'm acting like a professor out of habit, sorry.
Hi, I'm Ivan Chu. you said that one of the conditions for the successful American Revolution was the limited goals they had to replace the authoritarian system with an accountable one. But this goal actually was an enormously ideological, ambitious, and detailed one, but it was limited in this context because of their pre-existing conditions and institutions of self-governance. So I'm wondering if these two, the second condition is actually dependent on the first. Right? Having limited goals is dependent on having this existing tradition of self-governance. And then if that is the case, are we really only looking at semi-autonomous regions, right, that would, some of which are governed better or worse, that might have successful violent revolutions, like Kurdistan?
Yeah, I don't think they follow quite in that way. So for example, in Georgia and Ukraine, in the Rose Revolution, the Color Revolution, you had revolutions with limited goals, seeking just to create an accountable government in place of a corrupt and irresponsible one. They weren't based on long experience, and the result, of course, was messy and incomplete because of that. In both Ukraine and Georgia, it has taken a long time to make progress against entrenched corruption and to strengthen representative and judicial institutions. Nonetheless, the outcome is still more promising. Just as in Tunisia, which had a stronger civil society despite the dictatorship, you had a better chance of bringing a lot of groups into a peaceful negotiation for transition to democracy. Other countries where civil society was much weaker, for example, in Egypt, almost all of civil society was in the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood, even in its underground form. It dominated social welfare, it dominated informal communication, and so you ended up with a confrontation of the Muslim Brotherhood against the rest of society, and the rest of society eventually supported a military counter-revolution to free itself from that. So it's not so much, does the country have experience with prior democracy? That helps, for sure. But does the country have an elite and a professional class that's willing to seek limited goals and to work through compromise as they feel their way forward and avoid falling into the trap of a dominant ideology taking charge of the revolutionary effort? I mean, this has been a problem in Tunisia, where they've kind of had to resist Islamism taking over, but the successful resistance has created a space where other groups can negotiate a better outcome as long as that persists. Other areas in the Middle East have not been able to kind of exclude the radical Islamists on the one hand, leaving the militarists on the other. Now, the question earlier that was raised about what about countries like Turkey and China and Russia transitioning from Yeltsin to Putin that are closing up the space? Here, it was amazing to me that as Turkey, a NATO ally, became the leading prisoner of journalists in the world, the NATO allies said little or nothing. That as Poland and Hungary have started to undermine their principles that they engaged to uphold through their membership in the European Union has done very little in response, even rhetorically. And this strikes me as a big difference from the Cold War. And particularly, I mean, President Obama had a lot of weaknesses in his foreign policy, but he at least maintained a rhetoric of support for human rights and tried to diminish the standing of dictators, whereas a current administration seems to prize order above all alternatives and has been willing to be quite welcoming and even flattering of dictators like Sisi in Egypt and Erdogan in Turkey, and not to want to put any roadblocks to their exertion of domestic violence, repression, rigged elections, and so on. I mean, we'll see what's happening in Turkey. Erdogan has just called a snap election, and I expect it will not be conducted under free and fair standards of the previous ones that had elected him earlier. But again, we will see. But it is surprising to me. You don't have to support a revolutionary movement to resist these things, but one could object step by step to imprisoning journalists, denigrating, buying out the press, undermining judges, rigging elections, and so on. And that's the kind of thing that I think paves the way for peaceful resistance to become more effective when it does arise. And I think Steve was next.
Jack, could you give some iconic, I mean, we've had people have raised a number of examples of failures.
Right.
I mean, what would be your examples of iconic successes?
All right. You're talking about recent peaceful revolutions, right?
Even historically, whatever. I mean, that we might refer to as historical.
Okay. Well, again, you know, you probably know that the Chenoweth and Stefan book has dozens of successful examples, some more credible than others. But the stronger examples, surprisingly, the Philippine Revolution, as in many cases, when you have an authoritarian regime that feels on the defensive and tries to gain legitimation through an election that it hopes will affirm its continued rule, and things don't go quite as planned, that creates a dilemma for the ruler. You either have to somehow, I mean, rulers are getting better at fixing things in advance, I understand this. But nonetheless, when rulers feel the need to seek legitimacy and they allow some type of mobilization or election, they run the risk of it going more against them than they expect. And then there's a question of how far they can go to overturn the election results, interfere with institutions, or simply use repression. In the case of the Philippines, there was a risk that Marcos would have used the military to maintain his position. And in this case, the United States persuaded Marcos not to do so, allowing Cory Aquino to be inaugurated as president. That didn't create heaven in the Philippines, but it did put it on a path toward greater democracy and opportunity than had existed earlier. And I think that is a case where the United States was faced with a decision, came down on the side of here's a fairly peaceful, popular protest movement. If we encourage a negotiated solution by encouraging Marcos to leave, we've got a good chance of getting a fairly peaceful and democratic outcome. And that's what we got. And you know, Ramos was pretty good afterwards. Duterte, there are a lot of reasons to object. But Philippines has still undergone kind of a surprising economic revival and recovery in recent years. So that's a reasonably good case. Indonesia, the uprising after the financial crisis was awkward and messy, but there were enough actors with really strong U.S. rhetorical support to encourage the patients to work their way through. And in fact, I think one of the bad outcomes of the Indonesian revolution is that it created a situation of hope that, see, you know, things can change easily, so when we go into Iraq, we can change that easily as well. Because a lot of the same people were involved first in the Indonesian transition who then had great hopes for Iraq, which was an ethnically divided country with a very corrupt and authoritarian judiciary and military. It was very unlikely to work, and even under the best circumstances, given all the policy errors and so on. But Indonesia was a country that at least had, you know, some problems with the Chinese, but more or less had a kind of national unifying religious ideology and had been working toward a freer business class, and so that worked. So there are a number of cases that you can point to. Even surprisingly, Burkina Faso in 2014 had a largely peaceful revolution that overturned a military leadership. So everywhere you look in the world, if you want to be optimistic, I think there's reasons for hope.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Chaplain Buford at Marine Corps University. Appreciate the talk, sir. I guess clarification and then a question. The assertion of peaceful, you don't imply passive, first observation. Second, seemingly the premise of a peaceful movement, not passive, is to prick the consciousness of the oppressor. I'm curious on your thoughts in an age of information, of the battle of the narrative, where the oppressed may not have the money, the funds, the organizations. How can an entity navigate through that?
Very good question. You're absolutely right. Passive produces no results. So we're talking about very active, often high-risk engagement in campaigns of protest and civil disobedience. In some sense, part of the inspiration of this is the civil rights movement in the United States, which involved direct confrontations with law enforcement, and imprisonment, arrests, and so on. So all of that's involved. Some of the people who in Leipzig in Germany were asked after the successful protest against East Germany weren't you scared? Why did you go out and protest against this communist regime? Did you expect things would change? The answer they gave was, we were scared. We knew we might get shot, but we felt, in light of everything that was happening around us in the world, and they were talking about Poland and Gorbachev and Russia and so on, this was our chance to create a better future for our children and grandchildren, and we had to take it even despite the risks. And so you're right, it's a very active, risk-taking type of peaceful protest, not simply criticizing the regime on Twitter, okay? That doesn't work. Now, in terms of social media, there's been a lot of debate about whether Twitter, social media, Facebook, do they feed revolution? The answer is a little complicated. Throughout history, revolutionaries have relied on media to communicate among themselves, mobilize supporters, and plan the tactics of sit-in protest operations. Because you need to coordinate movement, you need to coordinate supplies, you need to coordinate self-protection. In the 17th century, one of the modes of communication was sermons from the pulpit. So Puritan preachers would not only in the church, but even in the street, mobilize people and inspire them and send the message of resistance to the papist monarchy. In the 18th century, pamphlets became the thing. The printing press operated and cheap pamphlets were churned out, presenting all kinds of ideological positions and recruiting people. Later, it became radio, then television, and cable news, and now social media. All of these are ways that allow people to communicate. Historically, the early phases of a new mode of communication have helped ordinary people outflank the government, because the government is usually a little late to realize and get on top of things. So the government eventually started sponsoring its own clerics to deliver messages, to do away with dangerous preachers. The governments learned to impose censorship and to put taxes and limits on the press. The government learned to take over state public radio and then to use TV as a propaganda tool. And China has gone very far in mastering, and Russia now too, as we've seen, mastering the use of social media to conduct campaigns that undermine opposition, sow confusion and doubt, and reinforce loyalty and the power of the central government. So there's always this kind of race between who's controlling a new mode of communication and can the government put a lid on it. I think that we're still in a stage where people can communicate to some degree by sharing cell phone. Even in China, WeChat is kind of a race between activists and opponents, the government, parodying Xi Jinping as the honey bear, Winnie the Pooh. For a while, that was one way activists sold their message. Then the government wised up and said, no, we're banning Winnie the Pooh on social media, right? So these games go on and on. In the long run, what's really important, though, is that the government starts to have some internal divisions, lose a little confidence, enough elites start to criticize that ordinary people feel emboldened to communicate among themselves, share their concerns, and will take the risk of going out in the streets to protest. And that uses old-fashioned word of mouth as well as all the more sophisticated means. So I think what we're going to continue to see is people will try to use whatever means they can, whether it's word of mouth, written messages that are passed from hand to hand, Twitter accounts, WeChat, Facebook, whatever's out there, people will try and use it. They also have to recognize, however, that the government is not passive either, that the government will also try and use these weapons against them. But if the government loses its resolve and unity, then opportunities for protest arise.
Thank you, Dr. Jack Goldstone, and we would like to see if you'd be willing to receive from us this gift as you begin the insurgency at George Mason University of wearing the Stockdale cover when you're on campus there. So,
I don't know if I'll be able to start an insurgency wearing a symbol of government power, but I'm proud to wear it nonetheless. Thank you very much.
Thank you.